when they came to Donington, people were just, you know, as we would now say, knocked out. I mean, you just couldn't believe it. The noise, the organisation, and apparently the smell. It smelled of boot polish, apparently. And the sight of these cars, it's got a sort of feel about it which you could never reproduce in a film now, I don't think.
It's a little homogenised, I thought, the film. It seemed to cut out swastikas, and the man in the peak cap with the moustache doesn't appear in this.
No, he doesn't. They don't mention Dick Seaman's death, and yet you can see Lang is almost in tears at the end of that race, which indeed he was.
I wonder if the original actually included Dick Seaman's accident in the 39
No, I've
Belgian
never seen
Grand Prix.
it. The Titans doesn't.
Because that race was run, you know, June, July. We were at war 3rd of September,
That's right.
39. I very much doubt if the film had actually been edited and put together by
Before
then. So by the time that film came out, you know, I don't think they would have been terribly well disposed towards talking about Seaman, other than the bit that they couldn't avoid, really, which was him winning the 38 German Grand Prix.
Yeah. Well, they didn't exactly go overboard.
Exactly.
It was all Bravo.
It was Mercedes won it.
Von Brachich and everything else.
Well, that was the big one for them, wasn't it? The German Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's that lovely story when, if you remember, Von Brachich's car catches fire at the Nürburgring, and Seaman had been told in no circumstances was it to overtake Von Brachich. When Seaman came in to refuel, Von Brachich's car is on fire and they're putting it out, and he won't overtake it. And you can see in the film Neubauer going up to him with his famous flag. And of course, the fire was put out, and Von Brachich forgot to lock the steering wheel. That's why he came off at the next... he comes back holding the wheel, if you remember, which is in the film. But Seaman apparently was killed because the marshal couldn't unlock the steering wheel to get him out of the car.
I've got some photographs, actually, of the Seaman
That's true,
wreck.
is it?
Well, it's worse than that, really, because, you know, the car hit a tree broadside on the left-hand corner, effectively, where the bus stop is now at Spa, and the modern pits has obliterated the Seaman memorial stone that used to be there. I don't know what happened to that stone. The car hit a tree broadside and effectively folded in two around the tree. And as it folded in two, they had a saddle tank, fuel tank, above their legs, connected by two great big 4 or 5 inch diameter trunking tubes going down each side of the cockpit into the tail tank. And as it broke around the tree, so the left-hand tube was pulled adrift, was pulled out of the scuttle tank, which dumped all its contents into the cockpit. So Seaman essentially had no chance, you know, from that point forward. But the steering wheel boss is still attached to the steering column, and the steering wheel spokes have been cropped off. You know, the spokes are still there with the ends curled and petalled where croppers have been through them. They must have found a pair of croppers and taken them to it. You know, God knows how much time it took.
He did survive for some time.
He did.
He died at 11:30.
He survived for quite some time, and he asked for a glass of beer.
That was his second crash, because he crashed with Von Delius, didn't he, in an earlier race?
Yes, and he'd had a testing crash at Monza.
Wasn't there some debate about whether he should have been driving for Mercedes for a German team at all at that time?
He was married to a German girl, of course.
He was a stunningly good driver. You've only got to look at some of the footage that was shot in 1936 of him driving his 9-year-old Delage at Donington Park in the JCC 200.
It had been rebuilt by Ramponi.
Absolutely, yes. but when you look at the way that he was driving it...
10-year-old car,
yes, absolutely. The car was never straight for 1 second through the curves. You know, the thing was fully afloat, and he could really drive hard.
Then?
No. He was, you know, Seagrave was paid.
He was very professional, Seaman, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, he was.
In his approach and attitude.
Absolutely. You know, despite his wealth, because he was fabulously wealthy.
So he didn't actually have to pay Mercedes for his drive?
Absolutely not. He wasn't a renter driver, no.
There's an interesting story about the Mercs of that period. When they were racing in the Tower of Floria, they had to paint the cars red because the bandits would fire at any non-red car.
Uhlenhaus apparently could have been a Grand Prix driver if he wasn't too valuable as a sort of tester stroke liaison man.
Yes, they wouldn't risk him. as a race. He was too valuable.
He was
the
too
case.
Did you ever meet him? Did you ever meet him?
No, I didn't.
He got very
Neubauer
deaf.
would have loved it today, wouldn't he, with all the pits to car communications and all the things you can
Oh,
do,
if you
all,
imagine it would
all
have
the
been
remote
incessant.
control stuff.
It would have been incessant. Him on the microphone.
Oh, completely, yes.
Yeah.
But he would have loved all the kind of scale extric side of things, of being able to sort of, change the telemetry and all kinds of things.
There was a lovely pit-to-car intercom or car-to-pit intercom story that Patrick Head told me about Nigel Mansell in the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim when he and Piquet were in the Williams Hondas, and Piquet was streaking off ahead, and Nigel was doing his best to keep with him, and Patrick was on the headset with Nigel, and he said it was just incessant. He said, "Patrick, it's not fair. He's leaving me. He's got more power than me. Patrick, it's not fair."
I tell you something I find...
I don't think Neubauer would have put up with that.
I tell you what I find interesting there is that if you look at these films and you see them there, the sort of huge spark plug box and a sort of chart of what
Box
to do.
of jets, too.
Yeah, that was wonderful, wasn't it? The box of jets.
The box was specially made so it sat on the bonnet. And each one was named with the name of the driver. And there must have been 250 jets. Can you imagine that?
Uhlenhaut is a very interesting character, because Uhlenhaut was brought up in England.
Wood Green.
Yes, and
Wood Green?
Yes.
he
I know Wood Green.
he was pretty much a keep fit fanatic all his life. And one of his methods of keeping fit was to avoid being too comfortable. And he told me that when they went to the Bremgarten in Bern for the Swiss Grand Prix in the 30s, he would always pitch his tent in the edge of the forest there, and he would just sleep in a simple, unquilted, unpadded sleeping bag on the ground in the tent. And so that he was always available with the cars. He never had to travel to a hotel and back.
Good Lord. Genuine sadomasochist.
Absolutely. Tomorrow's a cold bath.
His fitness paid off, because at the end of the war's end, he was running a factory, the Skoda factory in Czechoslovakia, making Daimler-Benz aero engines, and he walked back to Stuttgart. It's a fair old step. And was arrested on the way by British soldiers, and his English was so good they thought he was a spy. They were about to shoot him. And an officer, fortunately, who had been a motor racing enthusiast and had met him at Donington, intervened and released him.
Had his wartime issue of motorsport on him, probably.
That's
Just
right.
check him
Yes.
out. Just thinking, though, about that whole Mercedes-Benz Auto Union era, it was surely as much of a political statement, wasn't it, as anything else?
Yeah.
I mean, quite remarkable when you think of it in those terms.
Yes, they might not have had direct subsidies, but they were clearly an international statement of
Well, there was a
national
direct
aspiration.
subsidy, but it wasn't very great.
Yeah.
It nowhere near covered their expenditure.
But it must have been very cost-effective, either way you look at it. It got National Socialism around the world, as you said, not just in a visual way, but a very sort of smelly way, too, because everybody
That's
got...
right.
Well, of course, we don't see when Seaman wins the German Grand Prix in '38, we don't see him making a rather queasy Nazi salute at on
He
the
did make a
podium, do
salute.
we?
He did make
Oh
a
yes,
salute.
well, there are still
but the
photographs.
arm wasn't straight, was it? It was good 90 degrees
Yeah,
here.
it's rather like Tony Banks crossing his fingers behind his back.
Yeah.
and
Uhlenhaut
making
did
a little
say
arrow.
that...
How do you do a proper one, then, Doug?
Shall I demonstrate?
What I found interesting is that Neubauer ran the team like a military operation. I mean, it was a military operation.
Oh, yeah.
And despite that, in such an individualistic sport as motor racing, it paid off.
But Mercedes-Benz expenditure was always reckoned to be 7, 8, 9 times what Auto Union was spending. And it's very interesting today, when you look at the cars, you can see the difference in investment actually in the hardware, in the metalwork, because the Auto Unions have some extremely primitive looking, extremely roughly made, poorly welded items like the Dion tubes and things in areas where it wasn't terribly important. Near enough was good enough. Whereas in areas where it was crucial, the investment in their machining and their casting and so on is absolutely the equal of Mercedes-Benz. On the Mercedes side, if you look at a Mercedes-Benz, there is hardly an area on that car. There's hardly 1 square centimetre on any item that's assembled into that car where a guy hasn't been into it with a polishing tool or a grinding tool. You know, there's just nothing in it that
The
hasn't been
dashboard,
worked.
your engine turns.
That's
aren't
right.
they?
It may have been something to do with the quality of labour, though, because, I mean, there was a story about the auto unions, I think, and was it Dick Crosswaite telling me about a carburettor story? They washed off a carburettor. And
No, I'll tell you what that is. That's a bit... Well, that's the kind of story that makes the short hairs stand up on the back of your neck, actually, because Crosswaite and Gardiner are the small restoration company on a farm in Buxted in Sussex who have restored Mercedes Grand Prix cars, they restored Auto Union Grand Prix cars and almost any other kind of racing car you can think of. And they were given the job of cleaning up and restoring a lot of this Auto Union material that came back from Russia. And there was a guy who had the carburettor off one in the cabinet, gently bead blasting it to clean off the accumulation of years of gunk and gunge. As he was cleaning it off, he noticed that on one of the surfaces, on the casting on this carburettor, there was a little pictogram. When he looked closely at it, it was a Star of David struck into the carburettor with what looked like the point of a nail. And he said that, you know, his jaw dropped and he just went cold because that was probably the evidence of some poor sod in a salt mine somewhere towards the end of the war probably, where the cars were stored. Just leaving his mark. You know, and what happened to him or her? Who was he? How old was he or she? What happened to them?
Dick Crosswaite said that when he was restoring that engine, the head was so fragile that if you torqued it up sufficiently tightly to make it gas tight, it would begin to collapse.
Absolutely.
well, it's made out of monkey metal, wasn't it? I mean, the quality of
Monometal.
what?
Neil Corner, who is the oldest 16-year-old you'll ever meet, as you know. He's still hugely enthusiastic about everything. He had this remarkable pair of historic Grand Prix cars. He had a 1939 Mercedes for one end of the mantelpiece and a 1939 Auto Union for the other end of the mantelpiece. And he loved them both. And Dick Crosswaite was looking out, and John Gardner, his partner, were looking after the Auto Union. And they just couldn't get the head to seal, to keep water in the thing. So they took a little chunk out of it and sent it off to English Steel to get it analysed, to discover what the alloy was that Auto Union used. And Neil was quite full of this when he was telling me about it and saying, you know, how it was going to be analysed and they would find exactly what the alloy was and so on and so forth. Because I'm sure in his mind, you know, it had to be the most fantastic sort of 1938-39 equivalent of NASA unobtainium that you could possibly get.
Mega metal.
And the report came back from English Steel saying this is a something EN42 whatever, not obtainable today, but the nearest equivalent is so and so, so and so, so and so. Suggested uses: garden furniture.
Yeah, brilliant, isn't it?
Don't you think it's interesting about Mercedes, though, how the kind of culture persists? Mercedes were successful before the First World War, between the wars, and then again after the war when they came back in 54, 50, 55. Now they're back, and they're not being so successful, although the kind of, you know, the thoroughness is still there, very clearly. It's still the same Mercedes-Benz. But maybe it's an indication of the fact that Grand Prix racing is actually healthier and rather more competitive.
Well,
that Mercedes can't
the job's
just,
more difficult.
They can't just come back with their tartan seats and their three
steam
different
rollers don't work
windscreens.
anymore.
I thought it was interesting when the BMW chairman talking about Formula One the other week, and he said fairly unequivocally, if we come back, and of course we assume they are coming back, if we come back, the BMW engine will be a BMW engine. We will do it.
Really?
Yeah.
In-house.
Yeah, and he then went on to say,
Haven't done.
the only thing about the Mercedes engine is the three-ported star on it. We all know it's made in England, it's nothing to do with Mercedes.
What he was very impressed with the car when he drove
And
it.
that, you know, of course, that's the complete departure from Mercedes. That in fact, it is there. They have got their name on their engine, but it actually isn't coming from Stuttgart.
Interesting point that Uhlenhaut tells us, which I've forgotten about. Apparently, originally, the German national colour was white. And when they built the 750 kilogram Formula, the car was actually overweight. And I think they had to
Because
strip
it was
all
a
the...
maximum weight
They,
formula, not a minimum weight
somebody
formula.
suggested stripping all the paint off, which they did, and it got it down to the right. Not, they were silver.
Back to the alley.
Back to the L, and they've been silver ever since.
Yeah.
We look back at the old man and we see this tissue of extraordinary stories, many of which don't bear up to hard scrutiny, but they all make a terrific legend, every one of them. And what interests me about Ferrari is that it's a story as much, we think of it as, we think of Ferrari as embodying motor racing and as being a sort of story of unbroken success. In fact, it's a story as much of failure as, about failure of success.
Far more failure than... far more failure than, in fact, their facilities allow. You know, they've always been one of the best equipped, one of the best funded, well, not necessarily best funded, but certainly the best equipped.
But he always tries
outfits in
hard,
Formula
doesn't he? I
One.
mean, he's always been there. I mean, Ferrari have had a continuous post-war record. Of course, Scuderia Ferrari founded in 1929, running Alfa Romeo. So, I mean, you can argue the Ferrari name has been in motorsport from its dawn.
And the only one that's been there continuously since the beginning of the present World Championship.
One of motor racing's few remaining constants, actually.
Yeah.
I think that's why we were all so appalled this year to see the Transporter with the new sign writing on it. Since the beginning of time, the Transporter had always been red with the prancing horse and a few Magnetti Marelli or whatever down below, and suddenly to see, you know, the scrawled Scuderia Ferrari Marlboro, you know, in sort of fairly...
Yeah, you can imagine the old man bouncing
subtle
off the
sign
reveling
writing.
through his
down to
grave.
marketing.
Yes,
In the old man's era, that would
But he was the
never
person
have happened.
who said it was all right for a cigarette company to pay the drivers' salaries and thus opened the way for that
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing to happen,
that's true.
didn't he? I mean, I
That's
think he
true.
was... You know, it's easy to say, well, he wouldn't allow names on the car that, you know, that didn't contribute
Non-technical
to the non-technical names. But I don't think he was as scrupulous as all that.
No, he was malleable.
Do you think he was a control freak, though? Because we had back in the early 60s this thing about, I will never produce a car with an engine in the wrong place. I must have Barani wah wheels. Was he just sort of making, what, a pompous Italian statement?
Well, I think he was deeply conservative. There's no doubt about that. And also, he wasn't a designer. You know, he thought, you know, any car he had at the time was the right car to have. Because he couldn't see the design future because he didn't have that kind of technical capacity. Other people designed the cars for him. He was a fantastic entrepreneur, there's no doubt, a great survivalist, and an interesting politician, not always a very successful one, but in a way he invented modern Formula One politics, didn't he? You know, the paddock is the place of imbroglio that it is now, largely because of Enzo Ferrari, I would say.
He had favoured drivers, though, didn't he? Which he often fell out with. I mean, he sacked Fangio, didn't he?
He liked the Brits, though, you know.
He
What's
did,
quite
he-
interesting.
Yeah, he was particularly Peter Collins.
Peter Collins, yes.
Yeah.
Do you remember that team manager called Dragoni, who
Very well.
managed to annoy practically everybody and got rid of Surtees, for instance, when
And
Surtees, when Surtees had won them a world championship, and you know, they could have gone on to more success.
Yeah, well, the story was that Dragoni had more of the inside news on Mr. Ferrari and Mr. Ferrari's background than perhaps Mr. Ferrari thought was terribly comfortable. And therefore Dragoni could do almost anything.
Behind that veneer of Ferrari, as he was known to the public, lay perhaps quite an unpleasant sort of evil fellow who took delight in all sorts of things, like courting his dead drivers' widows, for instance, and whatever.
But humping was his hobby.
Yes, courting.
Well, he wasn't unique in that, was he?
That's something that never happens in Formula One today.
No, it's completely unknown. But he...
But he wasn't racing simply to sell his sports cars, was he? I mean, there was some other reason for the...
No, it was quite the other way around.
It was the other way around.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of the contract terms they have to sign these days, you know, like undertaking not to ride motorcycles and undertaking not to fly hang gliders and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, they're going out playing bloody tennis and things like that now, you know, whereas they used to be out drinking and whoring and shooting and you know, all the other things that
Well, proper normal way of life.
proper normal chaps sort of, you know,
Personally, I don't think
men behaving
I
badly.
don't think they're any different, really, essentially. And I do think we tend to put fairly simplistic sort of constructions on them. You know, we look at Schumacher and we see a confident person who happens to be German. So the adjective we attach to them for the rest of their careers is arrogant. And Schumacher, being confident and German,
Well,
is
there was
arrogant.
this
I
lovely...
don't think he is arrogant. I think
No.
he's a confident person who happens to be German. I think he's talking most of the time in his second language, which he more or less had to learn on the hoof while he was talking to mechanics, and you get a fairly limited vocabulary talking to mechanics. And, you know, I think he's a man who has a sense of humour and who has some, you know, reasonably interesting thoughts, but it's not very easy for him to express them in the context of the average press conference.
There was
No,
a lovely,
I
there
think
was a
there's more to
lovely
him
line
than we
from
allow.
somebody in the Jordan team who was asked what Ralph Schumacher was like, and they said, well, he's so arrogant that even Michael's noticed.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, but it's so fantastic to watch Schumacher go to Ferrari and turn
I
it
agree,
into a winning
absolutely.
team. To see that this is the biggest
Absolutely.
team in Formula One, the biggest motor racing team there has ever been.
Yeah.
It's been desperate for success all these years. It's been failing and failing and failing, getting itself into terrible messes. One man can go in and have that. You know, all right, there are
I think that's a very
no, there are
simple way
people
of
there
looking at
who brought him there. But even with the Jean Todt and Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne, if they had all those people, if they didn't have Schumacher, do you think they'd be winning races now? I don't think so. I think
The odd
no
one.
one else
The odd,
could
the
do
odd
that.
one.
effect
Yeah,
of
the
one
odd-
man
the
as a
odd one,
catalyst
yeah.
on a team
The odd one.
is really interesting in the context of this highly technical sport, that it still takes a human dimension
I think,
to do that.
you know, the other thing that's significant about what Schumacher has done, I mean, the last great driver they had there before Schumacher was Prost. Went there in 1990 and won 5 races.
You're not a fan of Nigel Mansell, then?
I said the last great driver.
Oh, right.
It is interesting the way that Schumacher's been accepted by the British public, whereas when he was dicing with Hill, everybody hated him.
Yeah.
But now they,
Well, I
they
think a
wanted
lot
to...
of that stemmed from that race
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Adelaide, you know,
Not
which
very-
we all have our own feelings about.
But I think there's correctly a real admiration for Schumacher.
I think there is.
Yes.
He's a wonderful driver.
And I think also, since then, I think the last year or two, he's mellowed considerably. I think
Maybe his English has got better.
Yes,
hasn't
it has, and he's also, I think he's much less jumpy, he's much less insecure than he was. He was at one time very quick to sort of, what are you getting at? What are you trying to say? Now he's
It's nice
he's
to see him
matured
run off at
and,
Silverstone. It did prove he was human.
well, I think, you know, there's nobody more committed than Schumacher.
No, he stays later and works harder. That's the
Absolutely,
thing,
and
really.
also the number of times you'll see Michael make a mistake in practice and in qualifying, when he's literally looking for he's running right at the edge, and he goes over it.
Yes, like Senna.
But in the race, almost never. Just like Senna, yes. Yeah. Senna always saw his career finishing with Ferrari.
Did he?
Yeah. At the back of his mind was always the thought that eventually he would go to Ferrari.
Jewel in the crown, sort of thing.
Yeah, and that he would drive his last Grand Prix in a Ferrari, and then he would stop.
But until recently, I mean, motor racing was bloody dangerous, wasn't it, in the 70s and the 60s?
Not that you'd ever get anybody to admit that was
No,
doing
but
it.
when you see those films, the number of people who were killed is the guys you see who you know are dead.
Sure.
That was one of the things at the time of Senna's accident, wasn't it? Because, you know, I mean, essentially the media made a real meal of the fact that 2 guys had just died in Formula One. And it struck me at the time that while that approach was understandable and was in many ways entirely justifiable, the reaction should have been that at the end of each of those 12 preceding years in which there hadn't been a fatality, we should have been saying, cool, well, we got away with it for another year. Because essentially it's always been a dangerous pursuit. It's just that a number of huge accidents that in earlier years and in earlier cars would undoubtedly have been fatal had actually ended with the driver walking away from it. You know, sort of changing his helmet for one that didn't have a dint in it, and then getting into the spare car and going out again, like Derek Warwick at Monza.
But it's also...
You know, coming out of the
yes,
parabolica.
yes,
That
yes.
would have been a fatal accident 10 years earlier.
Oh, absolutely.
But,
You know, he would have been brown bread.
Yes, I mean, if Senna hadn't been killed on the Sunday, one wonders how much fuss there would have been about Ratzenberger being killed the day before.
No.
Not very much,
No.
because Ratzenberger
And
wasn't
certainly
Senna.
the changes which have occurred in Formula One since would have been nothing like this draconian, nothing like
What, the annual rebuilding of Silverstone?
Oh, yes, and then the cutting the engine size, this sort of general, Jesus, we have to make this.
Sure, but look at Ferrari's
We have to make this
57,
acceptable in the
58 season. I mean, 6, I think, out of his 8 drivers died.
Yeah, Castellotti.
So Collins, Castellotti.
On a modern circuit, you know, that there are acres and acres of gravel traps each side. You know, the background is miles away from the car. you get very little impression of speed. The spectators themselves are far removed from the car. And Moss's point is that it takes exactly the same skill now for Schumacher to be doing what he's doing, that it took for Sterling to do what he did, that it took for Caracciolo to do what he did in the 30s, and for Benoit or whoever in the 20s. The point is that Stoll said, I think quite justifiably and quite properly, that he would pay good money to go and see somebody walking on a tightrope 200 feet up in the air without a safety net. It takes exactly the same skill for that guy to walk on a tightrope a foot above a carpet. But why bother to go and see it?
That's not the driver's fault or the
I'm not
sport's
saying
fault,
it is their fault.
It's humanity's
It's an
perception of the
effect
value
of
human life.
civilization.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, which is unfortunate.
But we're not prepared to see a car go into the crowd and kill 80 people anymore, are we?
No, but
and have the race carry on, as would have happened.
In point of fact, I mean, as Imola 94 showed, and Sid Watkins has made this point, it is sociologically unacceptable now for anybody to die in something that could be described as frivolous.
Yeah, there was a thing that George Abacassis, again, once I asked him about what it was like to be racing in sort of 46, 47, 48. You know, crikey, when you were racing between the trees and the telegraph poles and the stone walls and so on. Didn't you worry about safety? And he said, Doug, safety? He said, good God, my dear. He said, nobody was shooting at us.
Yes.
And against the background, you know, of having served through 6 years of war, you know, motor racing was the safest thing in the world.
Well, John Bosa overturned an ERA, and when I asked him about it, he said it was a very heavy car. What we forget now, of course, is in those days, the red cars of Italy were filling the first 10 places. It was the guys in the ERAs and the Altas who were the real heroes, I think. You remember sort of Hawthorne wearing an old army gas cape in a Cooper Bristol.
Well, that was brilliant for post-war racing, wasn't
Yes.
it? They salvaged anything from anywhere and bolted it up and stuck something on it, tires, and if it could race, it raced.
I once was talking to Bob Gerrard about an early British Grand Prix in which against the Alphas, and he was in an ERA, and I said, Bob, what was it like racing against the Alphas? You know, Fangio, Farina, Fagioli. He said, well, I think sort of racing against them isn't quite the way. We just sort of set off at the same time they did for 3 hours.
Look at Moss. He doesn't give any quarter. I mean, he still drives like there's no tomorrow. He's an object lesson to any young person who thinks he might be a race car driver or wants to know what their level of physical fitness is.
Yeah,
he's quite stupendous. For a man who's had a huge bang on the Swede,
That's the interesting thing with Sterling, because he is in such good nick and he is such a vibrant person. You know, and he's got this motto, you know, movement is tranquility. You know,
I never heard that before.
Well, that's the thing that he lives by. But people simply forget just how desperately badly he was injured in that accident.
Absolutely.
You know, he was asleep for a month. You know, he was paralysed down one side. His eyes were displaced relative one to another, and that was the thing apparently that screwed up his judgment, because his brain had always been used to judging distance from the baseline, and it knew that this baseline was between these two eyes that had been there since the day he was born, and now one of them was suddenly down here.
But I think, if you talk to him about safety, and like we were saying earlier on, did you ever think about safety? Did you ever talk about it among the drivers? And he said, no, we never did, because it literally never entered anybody's head that it could be safe. You know, it had always been dangerous, and of course it was always going to be racing cars.
That was the thing about if a car was going to catch fire, you know, well, I won't get burned because I'll jump out and run away.
Yeah. So I don't want a seatbelt.
Yeah, so I don't want to be strapped into it.
Or flame preventable.
Yeah.
It wasn't until
you'll be
spectators were killed at Le Mans that people really began to think, well, this really is too dangerous.
But as fans, how much of our interest in it was to do with the sense that these people had a tragic destiny? You know, that we grew up liking motor racing against the backdrop of these people. As Bernie Ecclestone said after Senna's death, that there was a kind of annual culling of racing drivers. You know? And that was the thing that told us that these were people doing something that we weren't prepared to do. You know, saving your presence, you know, you were. No racing driver goes out thinking he's going to die. You know, the thought disappears as soon as you get
Well, that's
behind,
the time you
behind
pack
the wheel.
up immediately. I think when Lauder decided to hang his helmet up, he obviously figured that this is it. The next one, it's not going to be my race to be doing. So you hang the helmet up.
When you painted your Ferrari Dino purple, you deserved to die in it when you crashed it.
I was killed in that car.
A perfectly good Ferrari Dino, and the bugger painted it purple.
Well, because my house was purple.
Oh, well, that explains it
Well,
all.
I had purple bumpers. And in the 60s, we were, unfortunately, not aware of our colours quite the way we are today.
It was the drugs.
Yeah.
Oh, it looked red too, is what you're saying.
Well, it seemed all right to me at the time. The 60s were strange, and I think one must be forgiven for what happened.